It's been a year of mounting crises in Iraq.
Gunfire and explosions have rocked Baghdad's high-security green zone in the past few hours.
At least 23 of Sadr's supporters were killed amid clashes.
When a mob stormed the government palace.
A demonstration of force by the populist Shiite cleric.
For more than 10 months, Iraq's elected lawmakers have been unable to form a government, accusing each other of corruption and treason. The prolonged deadlock has led to mass arrest, spilling out into violence between political factions. It's the worst fighting the country has seen in years, heightening fears of another civil war as Iraq grapples with instability and economic turmoil. Political infighting and alleged corruption have crippled Iraq's efforts to recover from the US invasion, sanctions, and the destructive war to defeat the so-called Islamic State in 2017. The country's political parties have squabbled over power and control of the country's vast oil wealth, the second largest in the region. In the background, the United States, as well as neighbouring Iran, have both grappled for control over factions, each attempting to exert their own interests in Iraq. Fed up with the politics, young Iraqis took over the streets to demand change.
So in October 2019, a protest movement emerged in Iraq. The October or Tishreen movement, and it strongly came out in condemning the ethno-confessional consociational government, the power-sharing model, and it condemned corruption, and it called for the dissolution of the system because they called it a racist, discriminating, sectarian way and discriminating way to govern. And in those protests, activists and protesters vocally chanted against both Iranian and US involvement. So it was a very unified voice against all foreign meddling. And this protest movement has caused a shift in the Iraqi consciousness, and it has shaken up the political system, which is what protest movements, what efficient and successful protest movements do, is disrupt the status quo. And this is exactly what the Tishreen movement did. It disrupted the status quo to the point that politicians now are grasping at straws, trying to prove that they're legitimate leaders, when in fact they're not. And when there was an election in October 2021, the voter turnout was super low, which raised questions about the legitimacy of the outcomes of the election and who would govern next.
In the aftermath of the 2003 US invasion, Iraq was split along sectarian lines between Sunni and Shia groups, whose fighting fueled violence and unrest in the country for years.
When you politicize an identity, political parties will fight over legitimacy, over who is the rightful representative of that group, whether it's an ethnic-based identity group or a racialized one or a sect-based identity. And in the Iraqi context, we have parties fighting over representing their ethno-confessional groups. So in the Kurdish region, we have the KDP and the PUK fighting to represent the Kurdish people. Among the Sunnis, we have Halbusi and Karbouli, two major political figures fighting over who will represent Sunnis. And amongst Shia, we have the strategic framework and the Sadrists fighting over who represents Shia. However, in the Sadrist context, he claims to represent all Iraqis, which is a little interesting because he has a history of killing Iraqis. And so does the strategic framework, mind you, that, both groups have armed factions, and this is what makes things even more difficult.
Various forces in Iraq have vied for influence in recent years. The deeply partisan politics echoed across the country's institutions, including the judiciary, the military and police, and the media. Successive Iraqi governments were plagued with ineffectiveness and alleged corruption, leading to mass protest movement in 2019. Ordinary Iraqis were united in calling out the dysfunction of the muhasasa system, an ethno-sectarian apportionment system that was imposed following the US invasion. The system distributes political power and state resources between three main religious and ethnic groups: Shia, Sunni, and Kurds. It was meant to unite Iraq and present a democratic alternative to Saddam Hussein's dictatorship and persecution. Civil service jobs and government contracts have also been distributed along these same ethno-sectarian lines, and as a result, governments have been unable to make key policy decisions and have failed to provide for even the most basic needs of their citizens. One of Iraq's key political players is Muqtada al-Sadr, who emerged as an influential Shia cleric in the aftermath of the civil war. He maintains great influence over many state institutions and controls a parliamentary group with thousands of members, often spurring them into action through social media posts. In October, he emerged as a clear winner in Iraq's election, but almost a year on had failed to form a government, faced with fierce opposition from rival Shia parties, namely the Iran-backed coordination framework.
Muqtada Sadr claims to be a reformer, claims to oppose the ethno-confessional system that I am describing to you. And he's arguing that he wants a government that's based on the majority, one that represents the people. And so he has refused any attempt from his political counterparts to come back to the table and reach consensus. And he has encouraged his supporters to go out in a quote-unquote revolution.
After his calls for the dissolution of parliament and fresh elections were ignored, al-Sadr tried to force his rival's hand, ordering his members to resign and his supporters to storm parliament and occupy it for weeks. Then, in August, al-Sadr announced he was leaving politics, further angering his followers, who stormed the presidential palace, fighting with supporters of rival Shia factions. The violence prompted Iran to close its air and land borders with Iraq, just as millions of Iranians were preparing for an annual pilgrimage to Shia shrines. Although the violence subsided after Sadr's call to his supporters to stop the protests, critics say it was merely a tactic to show his opponents his real influence in the streets. At the heart of Iraq's post-war woes is the ill-conceived muhasasa system of ethno-sectarian rule. Documents drawn up by both the US State Department and Department of Defense perceived Iraq as irrevocably divided along ethnic and religious lines, and this sectarian understanding dominated American perceptions of Iraq. In 2005, Iraq's new constitution allowed governorates to band together as federal regions and funnel oil revenues through sovereign structures, further weakening the country's central government. Ministries and their resources were divided among ethno-sectarian parties, leading to the exploitation of resources by different factions in their pursuit of gaining political ground against their rivals. This crippled the country's institution, hindering the government's ability to access its own economic capital. It also laid the seeds for de facto regional partitions, as would be seen in 2017 when Masoud Barzani announced a referendum to separate the Kurdistan region. But perhaps most devastatingly, this system of divided rule encouraged the rise of militias, each vying for control of Iraq's streets, fueling violence and corruption and pushing the fragile country into years of civil war. Today, Iraq remains bitterly divided, teetering on the edge of violence, with a political system unable to overcome its complex web of allegiances and rivalries.
The constitutional model doesn't work anymore. It was built on a house of cards, so to speak. And as we are seeing today, the most recent developments in the protest movement, we have to listen to people on the ground, to Iraqis on the ground, who are saying, separate religion from state. Most Iraqis want a complete separation of religion and state. They will celebrate religious differences, denominational differences, but they do not want any of those faiths and ideologies incorporated into governance and politics.